Production by Liang Gu, author of Sentimental Swordsman's Ruthless Sword, Gu Long. Chapter 1, Flying Knives and Quick Swords. The cold wind is like a knife, using the earth as a chopping board and treating all living beings as fish. Thousands of miles of flying snow turns the sky into a furnace and melts everything into silver. The snow was about to settle, the wind was still uncertain, and a carriage came from the north. The rolling wheels crushed the ice and snow on the ground, but they could not crush the loneliness between heaven and earth. Li Xuanhuan yawned and stretched his long legs as straight as possible on the soft mink fur. Although the carriage was warm and comfortable, the journey was too long and lonely. Not only did he feel tired, but he also felt disgusted. What he hated most in his life was loneliness, but he always lived with loneliness. Life is full of contradictions, and no one can do anything about it. Li Xuanhuan sighed and took out a wine bottle from the corner. While he was drinking heavily, he also coughed loudly. The constant coughing made his pale face turn a sickly red color, as if the fire in hell was burning his body and soul. When the bottle was empty, he picked up a knife. He began to carve a figure. The blade was thin and sharp, and his fingers were long and strong. This is a portrait of a woman. Under his skillful technique, the contours and lines of this portrait appear to be so soft and graceful, as if it is alive. Not only did he give her the moving lines also gave her life and soul, because his life and soul had quietly slipped away from under the blade. He is no longer young. The corners of his eyes were covered with wrinkles, and every wrinkle was filled with the sorrow and misfortune of his life. Only his eyes are young. These are a pair of strange eyes that seem to be green, like willow branches blown by the spring breeze, gentle and flexible, and like the sea water under the summer sun, full of pleasant vitality. Maybe it's because of these eyes. That's why he can live till now. Now that the portrait was finally completed, he stared at it dreamily for an unknown amount of time. Then he suddenly opened the car door and jumped out. The big man driving the cart immediately shouted and reined in the cart and horses. This big man has a beard all over his face. His eyes were as sharp as an eagle's, but when he moved his eyes to Li Xuanhuan, they immediately softened and were filled with loyal sympathy, just like a vicious dog looking at its owner. Li Xuanhuan actually dug a hole in the snow. He buried the newly carved figure deeply, and then stood dreamingly in front of the snowdrift. His fingers were frozen, his face was red from the cold, and his body was covered with snowflakes. But he didn't feel cold at all, buried in the snow. Just like the person closest to him, when he buried her, his own life became meaningless. If it had been anyone else, they would have been surprised to see him behave like this, but the big man driving the car seemed to be used to it, and just said softly, "It's almost dark, and there's still a long way to go. Master, get in the car quickly." Li Xuanhuan slowly turned around, and found that there was actually a line of footprints beside the rut. He came here alone from the far north, and then walked forward alone. The footprints were very deep. It was obvious that this man had walked a long way and was exhausted, but he still refused to stop and rest. Li Xuanhuan let out a long sigh and murmured, "In this kind of weather, I never expected that there would be people running around in the ice and snow and suffering. I think he must be a very lonely and pitiful person." The bearded man didn't say anything, but he sighed secretly in his heart, "Aren't you also a very lonely and pitiful person? Why do you always only know how to sympathize with others?" But he forgot himself. There were many pieces of solid pine wood under the car seat, and Li Xuanhuan started carving again. His technique was refined and skillful, because what he was carving was always the same person. This person not only occupied his heart, but also his body. The snow finally stopped. The coldness between heaven and earth is heavier, and the loneliness is thicker. Fortunately, there is already a sound of human footsteps in the wind here. Although this sound was much softer than the sound of horse hooves, it was the sound that Li Xuanhuan was expecting, so no matter how slight it was, he would never miss it either. So he raised the mink curtain and opened the window. He immediately saw the lonely figure walking in front. The man walked very slowly, but never stopped, even though he heard the sound of chariots and horses neighing. But never looked back. He didn't bring an umbrella or a hat. The melted ice and snow flowed along his face and into his neck. He only wore very thin clothes. But his back was still straight, and his body was as if it were made of iron, snow, ice, cold, and fatigue. Neither fatigue nor hunger could make him succumb. Nothing can make him give in. Li Xuanhuan saw his face only when the carriage arrived in front. His eyebrows are thick, his eyes are big, and his thin lips are pressed into a tight line. The straight nose makes his face look thinner. This face is easily associated with granite, stubborn, determined, indifferent to everything, even himself. But this was also the most handsome face Li Xuanhuan had ever seen in his life. Although he is still a little too young and not mature enough, he already has a charm that is attractive enough. There seemed to be a smile in Li Sunhuan's eyes. He opened the door and said, "Get in the car and I'll give you a ride." His words were always very simple and powerful. In this endless world of ice and snow, his offer was something that no one could refuse. Unexpectedly, the young man didn't even look at him, nor did he stop, as if he didn't hear anyone talking at all. Li Xuanhuan asked, "Are you deaf?" The young man's hand suddenly grasped the hilt of the sword at his waist. His hands were whiter than fish flesh due to the cold, but his movements were still very flexible. Li Xuanhuan smiled and said, "So you're not deaf, so come up and have a drink. A sip of wine won't do anyone any harm." The young man suddenly said, "I can't afford to drink." He actually said such a sentence. Li Xuanhuan even smiled in the wrinkles at the corners of his eyes, but he did not laugh, but said softly, "I'll buy you a drink, you don't need to spend money to buy it." The young man said, "I will never want anything I didn't buy myself, and I will never drink wine I didn't buy myself. Have I made my words clear enough?" Li Xuanhuan said, "It's clear enough." The young man said, "Okay, let's go." Li Xuanhuan was silent for a long time, then suddenly smiled and said, "Okay, I'll go. But when you can afford wine, will you buy me a drink?" The young man glared at him and said, "Okay, I'll treat you." Li Xuanhuan laughed, and the carriage sped away. Gradually, the young man's figure was no longer visible. Li Xuanhuan was still smiling and said, "Have you ever seen such a strange boy? I originally thought he must have gone through many vicissitudes of life, but what he said turned out to be so innocent and honest." The bearded man who was driving the car said calmly, "He is just a stubborn child." Li Xuanhuan said, "Can you see the sword in his belt?" The big man with beard also had a smile in his eyes, and said, "Can that be considered a sword? Strictly speaking, it really can't be regarded as a sword. It is just an iron piece more than 3 feet long. It has neither a blade nor a sword. There isn't even a hilt, just 2 pieces of cork nailed to it, which is the hilt." The big man with the beard smiled and continued, "In my opinion, it's just a child's toy." This time, instead of laughing, Li Xuanhuan sighed and murmured, "In my opinion, this toy is very dangerous, so it's better not to play with it. The inn in the town is not big, but now it is full of tourists who have been blocked by the wind and snow, and it seems to be extremely crowded and lively. There are more than a dozen straw mats piled in the yard. Covered empty escort cart. The straw mat was also covered with snow, and under the eaves on the east side, a maroon-colored dart flag trimmed with gold was placed diagonally. It was blown by the wind and made a hunting sound, making it almost impossible to tell that the gold embroidered on it was a tiger or a lion. In the restaurant in front of the inn, from time to time, big men wearing sheepskin coats came in and out. Some of them deliberately opened their clothes after drinking a few glasses of wine to show that they were not afraid of the cold. When Li Xuanhuan arrived here, there was not even an empty bunk in the inn, but he was not in a hurry at all. Because he knew that there were not many things in the world that money could not buy, he first found a table in the corner of the restaurant, ordered a bottle of wine, and drank slowly. He didn't drink quickly, but he could drink continuously for days and nights. He kept drinking. I kept coughing and it was getting dark. The bearded man had already walked in, stood behind him, and said, "The upper room on the south side has been vacated and cleaned. The young master can rest at any time." Li Xuanhuan seemed to have known for a long time that he would definitely handle this matter, so he just nodded. After a while, the bearded man suddenly said again, "There are people from the Golden Lion Escort Bureau who live in this inn. It seems that they have just been escorted from outside." "Dart back." Li Xuanhuan said, "Oh. Who is escorting the escort?" The big man with beard said, "That's the rapid wind sword, Zhuge." Li Xuanhuan frowned, then smiled and said, "It's not easy for this madman to survive to this day." Although he was talking to the people behind him, his eyes were always staring at the door in front that was covered with cotton curtains, as if waiting for someone. The big man with beard said, "The child's footsteps are not very fast. I'm afraid he will have to wait until the watch to get here." Li Xuanhuan smiled and said, "I don't think he can't walk fast, it's just that he doesn't want to waste his energy. Have you ever seen a wolf walking on the snow? If there is no prey in front of it and no pursuers behind it, it will definitely not be willing to walk fast, because it feels that it would be a pity to just use its strength on walking." The big man with beard also smiled and said, "But the child was not a wolf." Li Xuanhuan said nothing more, because at this time he started coughing again. Then, he saw 3 people walking into the restaurant from a door at the back. The 3 people spoke loudly and were talking about those. Li Xuanhuan recognized the fat man with a purple face among them as the quick wind sword, but he seemed unwilling to do so. The other party recognized him, so he lowered his head to carve his portrait. Fortunately, after Zhuge Liang arrived in this small town, he didn't even look at anyone. They quickly ordered food and drinks and started eating and drinking. But the food and wine could not stop their mouths. After drinking a few glasses of wine, Zhuge Liang became even more proud. Laughing loudly, "Second brother, do you still remember the day we met the Taihang 4 tigers at the foot of Taihang Mountain?" Another person laughed and said, "Why don't I remember that day the 4 tigers of Taihang dared to touch the batch of red goods that the eldest brother had protected?" The 4 of them showed off their power and said, "As long as you Zhuge Liang crawl around on the ground, our brothers will let you cross the mountain immediately, otherwise we will not only keep your red goods, but also your head." The third person also laughed and said, "Who knows, their swords haven't been cut off yet. The elder brother's sword has pierced their throats." The second person said, "I, Zhao Laoer, are not bragging. If we talk about the strong palm power, it is naturally our chief escort's golden lion palm. There is no one better than our big brother." Zhuge Liang raised his glass and laughed, but his laughter suddenly stopped. He saw that the thick cotton curtain